When the gunfire stopped, Daniel Harper didn't feel relief. He felt something far worse: silence. Because in Vietnam, silence usually meant one thing: you were alone, and the enemy was close. The patrol was not meant to go this far. It had been briefed as routine, another slow sweep through dense jungle near the border, a show of presence more than a real hunt. Daniel Harper had learned that word quickly in Vietnam: routine. It was the word officers used when they wanted to convince themselves and the men beneath them that nothing unexpected would happen. Daniel walked near the rear of the formation, his rifle held low but ready. He was no longer the frightened 19-year-old who had arrived weeks earlier. He had learned how to move quietly, how to read the jungle in small ways: broken branches, disturbed soil, the unnatural stillness that sometimes meant someone was watching. The men around him moved with practiced rhythm. Step, pause, listen. The jungle breathed around them. Sweat ran down Daniel's back, soaking into his uniform. His boots sank slightly into the damp ground with every step. Somewhere overhead, insects screamed. Somewhere farther away, a bird took flight suddenly, and several men stiffened before relaxing again. Then the world exploded. The blast came from the left side of the formation, a violent concussion that tore dirt, leaves, and smoke into the air. Daniel felt the shockwave hit his chest before his ears caught up. The sound was deafening, metallic, wrong. Someone screamed. Someone fell. "Contact!" a voice shouted. Rifles came up instantly. Men dove for cover. Daniel dropped to one knee behind a tree, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might betray him. He fired without aiming, following the instinct drilled into him during training. Muzzle flashes lit the jungle in sharp bursts of orange. The noise collapsed into chaos. Orders overlapped. Someone yelled for a medic. Another voice screamed in pain, raw and uncontrolled. Daniel tried to look for familiar faces, for the shape of his squad leader, for anyone who could tell him what to do next. Smoke swallowed everything. Branches snapped under running boots. Leaves fell like rain. The jungle, which moments earlier had felt heavy and slow, now seemed alive with movement. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the gunfire faded. Not stopped, faded. The echoes rolled away into the trees, leaving behind a silence that felt unnatural, like the jungle itself was holding its breath. Daniel stayed frozen, rifle raised, waiting for another burst of fire that never came. "Harper!" he shouted, then realized he had said his own name. He swallowed and tried again. "Hello?" No answer. The smoke thinned slowly. Shapes reappeared: trees, vines, empty ground. No men. Daniel stood up cautiously, turning in a slow circle. His ears rang. His hands shook despite his effort to steady them. He took a step forward, then another, scanning for movement, for a helmet, for anything familiar. Nothing. He moved faster now, heart pounding. "Hey!" he called again, louder this time. The jungle answered with insects and distant wind. That was when it hit him, not as panic, but as cold understanding. The patrol had moved, the fight had shifted, and Daniel Harper had been left behind. For the first time since arriving in Vietnam, there was no formation around him, no commands, no reassurance of numbers, just one American soldier standing alone in hostile jungle. Daniel checked his radio with trembling fingers. He turned the dial, adjusted the antenna, pressed the button, and spoke. "This is Harper. I'm separated. Do you copy?" Static hissed softly. He tried again. Nothing. The realization settled into his chest slowly, like something heavy being lowered into place. He was lost, not temporarily separated, not momentarily confused, lost behind enemy lines. Daniel leaned against a tree, forcing himself to breathe slowly. He knew panic would kill him faster than any bullet. He had been taught that much, at least. But training did not prepare him for this. There was no enemy in front of him to shoot, no clear direction to follow, no voice telling him what came next. Only the jungle, and the knowledge that somewhere out there men were moving who would not hesitate to kill him if they found him. Daniel adjusted his grip on his rifle. This was no longer a patrol. This was survival. Daniel did not move for a long time. The jungle around him settled back into its natural rhythm as if nothing violent had ever happened. Insects buzzed, leaves shifted. Somewhere far away, a bird cried out and then fell silent again. Daniel forced himself to listen, not just with his ears, but with his whole body. Training told him that the jungle always spoke first. If it suddenly went quiet, danger was close. He checked his surroundings carefully. No fresh movement, no voices, No gunfire, just thick green walls in every direction. He glanced at his compass, wiping sweat from the glass with his sleeve. The needle trembled, then steadied. He had a direction, but no destination. His platoon could be anywhere now, or nowhere near him at all. Daniel crouched low and began to think. Panic whispered at the edges of his mind, but he pushed it down. Panic made noise. Noise got you killed. He inventoried what he had just as he'd been taught. One rifle, 3 magazines, a half-empty canteen, a radio that might as well have been a brick, a knife, a small packet of rations. Not enough for long. Certainly not enough for mistakes. He made a decision. He would move. Standing still meant being found. Movement, if done carefully, meant a chance. Daniel chose a direction that felt right, not toward where the fighting had been, but away from it. He stepped slowly, deliberately, placing his boots where leaves were already disturbed, avoiding snapping branches. Every few steps he stopped, listened, waited. Hours passed that way, though time no longer felt real. The jungle pressed in from all sides, hot and damp. Sweat soaked through his uniform. Leeches clung to his socks. He brushed them away without a sound. Hunger gnawed at him, but fear kept it distant. As the light began to fade, Daniel realized night was coming. Night in Vietnam was a different world. Shapes vanished. Distance collapsed. Sounds grew closer than they should have been. He knew moving after dark was dangerous, but staying in one place was worse. He found a cluster of thick roots near a fallen tree and settled there, pulling his poncho tight around him. He did not sleep. He watched. Sometime after midnight, he heard voices. They were low, measured, speaking a language he didn't understand, but he didn't need to. The cadence was wrong. Too calm, too confident. Daniel's heart pounded as shadows moved between trees not 30 yards away. He raised his rifle, finger trembling near the trigger. One shot would give him power and end him just as quickly. He stayed still. The voices passed. When morning came, Daniel was still alive. He stood slowly, muscles stiff, mind sharp with exhaustion. He did not feel like a soldier anymore. He felt like prey that had escaped by inches. And he understood something then with terrifying clarity. This was no longer about the war. It was about getting home. Daniel Harper took one last look at the jungle behind him and started walking again, deeper into unknown territory, carrying nothing but his training, his fear, and the stubborn belief that he would survive. He had no idea how wrong and how right he was about to be. By midday, the jungle felt smaller, not because it had changed, but because Daniel Harper had begun to understand it. Every step carried risk now. Every sound had meaning. He moved slowly, crouched low, keeping to shadow where he could. The sun pressed down through the canopy in broken beams, turning the air thick and heavy. Sweat ran constantly, soaking his uniform, stinging his eyes. His canteen was nearly empty. Daniel shook it once, listening to the faint slosh inside. Not much left. He tightened the cap anyway, as if that might somehow preserve what little remained. Water had already become more valuable than ammunition. Without it, he knew, nothing else would matter. He forced himself not to drink. Instead, he focused on movement. Quiet, controlled. He stepped only where the ground was already disturbed, avoiding dry branches and loose leaves. Every few minutes, he stopped completely, not just pausing, freezing, listening until his heartbeat slowed enough for him to hear beyond it. The jungle spoke constantly, but not loudly. Insects buzzed, birds called, wind shifted leaves in slow waves. Daniel learned to notice when those sounds changed, not stopped, but adjusted subtly, like a room falling quiet when a stranger enters. That was when he heard it. Footsteps, not close, but not far enough to ignore. Daniel dropped to one knee and then lower, easing himself behind a thick tree trunk. He pressed his body flat against the bark, rifle angled down but ready. His breathing slowed. In, out, slow enough not to fog the air in front of his face. The footsteps came again, measured, deliberate. Then voices, low, calm, confident. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. These were not frightened men. They were not rushing. They were searching. Daniel's mouth went dry, not just from thirst, but from fear. He tightened his grip on the rifle. The instinct to raise it was strong, the instinct to run even stronger. He ignored both. Movement would give him away. Minutes stretched. Sweat dripped from his brow, sliding down his nose. He resisted the urge to wipe it away. A single careless motion could be enough. A shape moved through the trees. Then another. Daniel saw them clearly now. Dark uniforms blending into the green, rifles slung casually, heads turning as they scanned the jungle. One of them stopped. Too close. No more than 20 yards away. Daniel felt his pulse hammer in his throat. The man knelt, brushing aside leaves, examining the ground. Daniel's boot print lay only a few feet beyond his reach. If the man followed it just a little farther, a shout came from deeper in the jungle. The man looked up, answered briefly, then stood. He took one last glance around before moving on. Daniel did not move. Not when the footsteps faded, not when the voices disappeared, not when his muscles began to ache and cramp. Only when the jungle's rhythm fully returned did he allow himself to breathe again. He waited another 10 minutes before shifting. When he finally moved, he changed direction. Every instinct told him the enemy was between him and wherever his unit might be. He angled away, deeper into unfamiliar territory, choosing terrain that would slow pursuit: thick undergrowth, uneven ground, tangled roots. The heat worsened as the afternoon dragged on. Daniel's throat burned. His tongue felt thick. He swallowed dryly, again and again. He finally allowed himself one small sip of water, barely enough to wet his mouth. It did nothing to ease the thirst. It only reminded him how little he had left. By late afternoon, dizziness crept in at the edges of his vision. He stumbled once, catching himself against a tree. He cursed silently. Fatigue made noise. Mistakes made death. He forced himself onward, step by careful step. Then he heard the helicopter. For a moment, hope flared, bright and dangerous. He looked up through the canopy, searching for movement, for the familiar shape of a Huey cutting through the sky. The sound passed overhead and faded. No markings, no lowering rope, no rescue. Just another reminder that this jungle belonged to someone else. As evening approached, Daniel found a shallow depression near a cluster of rocks. He lowered himself into it slowly, pulling foliage over his position just enough to break his outline. He lay still, rifle across his chest, eyes scanning the shadows. Night would come soon, and with it, the hunters would return. Daniel Harper closed his eyes for just a moment, not to sleep, but to steady himself. He thought of water, of home, of voices that didn't whisper in the dark. Then he opened his eyes again. The jungle was already changing, and he knew tomorrow would be worse. Daniel woke before dawn, not because he wanted to, but because his body refused to rest. His mouth felt like sandpaper, his lips were cracked and swollen. When he swallowed, there was nothing there. No moisture, no relief, only a dull, burning ache that ran from his throat down into his chest. For a moment, he lay still, confused, unsure where he was. Then memory rushed back. The jungle. The voices. The hiding. He was still alone. Daniel reached for his canteen automatically, then froze. He already knew what he would find. He unscrewed the cap anyway and tilted it carefully. One last swallow slid into his mouth, warm, metallic, barely enough to count as water. The canteen was empty. He stared at it for a long moment as if willing more liquid to appear. Then he clipped it back onto his belt. An empty canteen was still better than none. It meant survival was possible. At least, that was what he told himself. Morning light crept slowly through the trees, turning shadows into vague shapes. Daniel pushed himself up, joints stiff, head pounding. Standing too quickly sent a wave of dizziness through him. He grabbed a tree to steady himself and waited until the world stopped spinning. Water. He needed water. Training surfaced in fragments. Collect rainwater, follow animal trails, look for low ground. But training had been delivered in classrooms, on chalkboards under clear skies. Here, everything was uncertainty. Every step cost energy he didn't have. He began moving again, slower than before. The jungle smelled sharper now. Damp earth, rotting leaves, something sweet and sour at the same time. His senses felt exaggerated, stretched thin by thirst. Sounds seemed closer, colors brighter, shadows deeper. By late morning, the first hallucination came. Daniel heard his name, clear, familiar. Danny. He stopped instantly. No one had called him that since Ohio. His heart raced as he turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, no footsteps, no voices, just insects and wind. It wasn't real. He knew that. He told himself that. But the voice had sounded so close. He shook his head and continued, forcing his focus onto the ground in front of him. One step, then another. Don't think too far ahead, just move. The sun climbed higher, pressing heat down through the canopy. Daniel's vision blurred at the edges. His thoughts drifted without warning. He found himself remembering small, useless details. His mother's kitchen table, the way dust floated in the air during summer afternoons, the sound of a high school football crowd under the lights. He caught himself smiling once. That scared him more than anything else. By early afternoon, he found a shallow stream. At least, he thought he did. Daniel stumbled toward it, heart surging with hope. He dropped to his knees and plunged his hands into the water, only to feel mud. There was no stream, just damp ground and decaying leaves. The disappointment hit him hard. He laughed once, short and sharp, then pressed his forehead into the dirt until the feeling passed. Crying would waste water he didn't have. When he stood again, he realized he had made a mistake. He had left cover. The jungle ahead was thinner, lighter, open, and someone was there. Daniel saw movement first, a flicker between trees, then a figure, then another. They weren't close, but they were close enough. Enemy soldiers. They hadn't seen him yet. Daniel dropped instantly, flattening himself against the ground. His heart slammed against his ribs. His breath came too fast. He forced it slower, slower, until it barely moved his chest. One of the men spoke. Another laughed quietly. They moved closer. Daniel felt panic rise, sharp and overwhelming. His fingers tightened around his rifle. He imagined firing. He imagined running. He imagined water spilling from canteens he would never reach. A sudden cough escaped his throat. Quiet, but not quiet enough. The voices stopped. Daniel closed his eyes. Footsteps shifted. Someone spoke again, sharper this time, closer. Daniel rolled sideways, inch by inch, pressing himself into thicker brush. Thorns tore at his sleeves. Pain flared, but he welcomed it. Pain meant he was still in control. A branch snapped somewhere nearby. Daniel froze completely. Seconds passed. Then a shout, farther away. The soldiers turned, distracted. One of them cursed. They moved off, drawn by something else. Another sound. Another problem. Daniel remained where he was long after they were gone. When he finally moved, it was on shaking legs. He understood now with brutal clarity. Thirst was not just weakening him. It was making him careless, dangerous. If he didn't find water soon, the enemy wouldn't have to. The jungle would finish the job. As night began to fall again, Daniel Harper dragged himself deeper into cover, every step heavier than the last. His thoughts blurred. His vision darkened. Somewhere in the distance, rain thundered, too far away. Daniel looked up at the darkening sky and whispered a word he hadn't said since childhood. Please. The jungle did not answer. The rain came suddenly, not as relief, but as violence. One moment the jungle was heavy and waiting. The next, the sky cracked open. Rain slammed down through the canopy in thick, punishing sheets, drenching everything in seconds. Leaves shuddered under the impact. Mud loosened. The air turned cold and sharp. Daniel barely had time to react. He lunged forward, half slipping, half running, until he reached a shallow depression beneath a cluster of broad-leafed plants. He tore his poncho free and stretched it wide, anchoring the corners with rocks and roots, hands moving on instinct. Water began to pool immediately. Daniel pressed his face close, hands trembling as he guided the runoff toward his mouth. He drank too fast at first, coughing, choking as water spilled down his chin and soaked his collar. He didn't care. He drank again, and again. The pain in his chest eased slightly. The burning in his throat softened into something bearable. He forced himself to stop. Training, what little of it still applied, screamed at him not to drink too much too fast. He waited, counted his breaths, then took slower sips, letting the water settle. For the first time in 2 days, his mind felt almost clear. Almost. The rain masked sound, but it also erased warning. Footsteps, voices, movement. Everything blurred into the same constant roar. Daniel knew he couldn't stay long. He folded the poncho, filled the canteen as much as he could, and moved on, keeping low, keeping slow. Every muscle ached now. His boots were heavy with mud. His uniform clung to him like a second skin. Then the ground gave way. Daniel didn't see it. He felt it. One moment solid earth, the next empty air. He fell hard, tumbling down a shallow slope into thick brush. Pain exploded through his left leg as something twisted the wrong way. He bit down on a scream, tasting blood as his teeth cut into his lip. He lay still, breath ragged, rain soaking into him. When he tried to move, fire shot up from his ankle. Not broken. He knew that much. Broken hurt differently. This was worse in another way, sharp, unstable. A sprain, maybe torn ligaments. Enough to slow him. Enough to kill him. Daniel dragged himself into thicker cover, pulling vines and leaves over his body until he was nothing but another shape in the jungle. He bound his ankle tightly with a strip torn from his shirt, hands clumsy but determined. He could not stop. Stopping meant dying. By late afternoon, the rain eased. Steam rose from the jungle floor as heat returned, thick and suffocating. Daniel limped forward, each step a negotiation with pain. That was when he heard them again. Not close, but not far. Voices. Multiple. Moving with purpose. Daniel dropped instantly, crawling into the base of a fallen tree, heart pounding so hard it blurred his vision. He pressed his cheek into the mud, rifle cradled against his chest. The voices grew louder. He could distinguish tones now. Short commands, familiar cadence. Not villagers. Soldiers. They passed within 20 yards. Daniel watched boots splash through mud, saw the edge of a rifle barrel. A man laughed quietly at something said behind him. If one of them turned his head just a little, they would see him. Daniel slowed his breathing until it hurt, counted heartbeats, thought of nothing. Minutes stretched thin, then they were gone. The jungle swallowed them as easily as it had hidden him. Daniel lay there long after the sound faded, rainwater dripping from leaves onto his helmet in slow, mocking taps. He had water now. Barely enough movement, barely enough luck, but luck was thinning. As night fell for the third time, Daniel Harper understood something he had not wanted to admit. Surviving wasn't about being strong. It was about lasting just a little longer than the jungle, and the men hunting him expected you to. And he was running out of margins. Daniel moved at dawn, not because it was safer, but because staying still had begun to feel like surrender. The jungle looked different in the early light. Less mysterious, more honest, and far more dangerous. Every step sent a quiet warning through his injured ankle. He adjusted his pace, slower now, careful to distribute his weight. Pain was constant, but manageable. What frightened him more was the feeling that something had changed. The jungle was no longer just around him. It had been used. Daniel stopped abruptly and crouched low. In front of him, a thin vine stretched across the forest floor, too straight, too deliberate. His eyes followed it to a bent sapling, tension held tight by a crude knot. A trap. Simple. Fast. Deadly. If he had taken one more step, the sapling would have snapped upright, whipping sharpened bamboo through the air at chest height. Daniel backed away slowly, heart pounding. This wasn't random jungle defense. This wasn't something left behind days ago. This trap was fresh. He scanned the ground more carefully now, reading it the way his instructors had taught him, though they had never imagined him doing this alone. Broken leaves pressed into the soil, mud disturbed then partially brushed smooth. Footprints, boot-shaped, not animal, and not old. Someone had passed through here recently. Multiple someones. Daniel swallowed. They weren't moving through the area, they were working it. He shifted direction, angling away from the trap when something else caught his eye. A small clearing, barely visible through overlapping leaves. At its center sat a tin cup, tipped on its side. Beside it, a fire pit, cold now, but not empty. Daniel crept closer, every sense screaming caution. The ashes were gray, but beneath them, black charcoal still held shape. He reached out and hovered his hand above the pit. Warm. Not hot, but warm enough. Someone had eaten here, recently. The realization settled heavily in his chest. They were close. Daniel retreated slowly, every instinct urging him to run, but he didn't. Running made noise. Noise made mistakes. He moved laterally instead, using brush and fallen logs to break his outline, leaving no straight trail behind him. His breathing stayed shallow, controlled. Then his foot pressed down on something that shifted. Daniel froze. A faint creak came from beneath the leaves. He lifted his foot slowly, carefully. A wooden spike lay hidden beneath the mud, angled upward. Another step, just inches forward, would have driven it straight through his boot. Another trap, cruder than the first. Faster to build. Built in a hurry. His hands trembled as he eased backward. They were tightening the net. Daniel's mind raced. He tried to think like them. Where would he expect someone to go? Toward water. Toward lower ground. Toward cover. They weren't guessing. They were anticipating. That was when he heard it. A sound so soft he almost convinced himself it wasn't real. A whistle. Short. Sharp. Controlled. It came from his left. Then another answered it, farther away to his right. Daniel's blood ran cold. Signals. Not shouting. Not careless noise. Coordination. They were close enough to hear each other without raising their voices. And that meant they were close enough to hear him. Daniel dropped flat against the ground, pressing his body into the earth, ignoring the pain in his ankle. He covered his mouth with his sleeve, forcing his breathing to slow. The whistle came again, closer this time. Daniel stared at the dirt inches from his face, every muscle locked, heart beating so loudly he was sure it would betray him. Boots crunched softly somewhere nearby. Leaves shifted. A voice murmured something he couldn't understand, but the tone was calm, confident. They knew someone was here. They just didn't know exactly where, yet. Daniel stayed still. He did not move. He did not think about Ohio, or home, or survival. He thought only about becoming invisible. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, the footsteps drifted away, swallowed by the jungle, the whistles faded. Daniel remained where he was, long after the sounds disappeared. When he finally moved, it was with absolute certainty. He was no longer lost in the jungle. He was being hunted, and the jungle was helping them. Daniel moved only when he was sure the jungle had fully reclaimed the sounds of pursuit. Every step now carried weight beyond pain. His ankle burned, swollen and stiff, but he welcomed the pain. It kept him anchored to the present. Pain meant he was still conscious, still alive. The jungle felt tighter than before, not physically, but mentally. Every vine looked like a snare. Every shadow felt occupied. He no longer trusted distance. Sound traveled strangely here, bending, echoing, lying. A snapped twig could be 10 yards away, or 1. He stopped near a low ridge and crouched, listening. Nothing obvious. That worried him more than noise. The enemy had learned his silence. They were matching it. Daniel adjusted his direction again, deliberately avoiding anything that looked like an easy path. Easy paths were invitations. He pushed through thicker brush, letting thorns tear at his sleeves and arms. Blood ran in thin lines down his skin. He did not wipe it away. Blood dried. Blood stopped. Sound didn't. By midday, exhaustion began to erode his discipline. His thoughts slowed. Decisions took longer. He caught himself standing too long in one place, staring without seeing. Once he nearly stepped out into a clearing before stopping himself at the last second. That scared him. He forced himself to kneel, pressed his forehead against the cool earth, and breathed. In, out, slow, deliberate. Training resurfaced again, not as instructions, but as warnings. Fatigue made men careless. Carelessness got them killed. When he lifted his head, he noticed something that made his stomach twist. A footprint. Not old, not blurred by rain. Clear enough to see the edge of the tread, and it pointed toward him. Daniel turned slowly, scanning behind him. Another footprint, then another, spaced evenly, controlled pace. They were circling. He backed away, heart pounding, and nearly collided with a tree trunk. He froze, pressing himself against it, rifle tight to his chest. His breath came shallow despite his effort to slow it. That was when he heard movement again. Not whistles this time, not voices, footsteps. Careful, measured, too disciplined to be accidental. Daniel lowered himself inch by inch until he was nearly flat, his cheek against the damp bark. He could smell the tree, sap and rot and rain. The jungle's breath filled his lungs. A shadow passed through his peripheral vision, close. So close he could hear fabric brush against leaves. Daniel's finger rested against the trigger guard, not inside it. One shot would mean noise. Noise would mean everything. The footsteps paused. A branch shifted. Someone was listening. Daniel did something he had never practiced, something no instructor had taught him. He stopped trying to think like a soldier. He thought like an animal. He went still. Not tense, not ready, just still. No anticipation, no reaction. He let his thoughts empty until even fear dulled. Seconds stretched, then longer. Finally, the footsteps moved on. Only then did Daniel realize his jaw ached from clenching it. When he dared to move again, it was not forward, not back. He changed direction completely, forcing himself downhill toward thicker ground and worse visibility, toward places men avoided because they were slow and miserable, toward places the enemy might not expect. As dusk approached, Daniel Harper understood the truth he had been resisting. This was no longer about evasion. It was about endurance, about how long a 19-year-old body could keep going while the jungle, the pain, and the men hunting him applied pressure from every side. Night was coming again, and Daniel did not know if he had enough left to survive it. Night fell without warning. One moment, the jungle was dim and uncertain. The next, it was gone entirely. Darkness in Vietnam did not arrive gently. It dropped, heavy and absolute, as if someone had thrown a blanket over the world. Daniel felt it before he fully saw it. The temperature dipped just enough to raise goosebumps on his arms. The sounds changed. Day insects faded. Night creatures took their place. Daniel stopped moving. He had learned that lesson quickly. Moving at night was how men vanished. He lowered himself into a shallow depression between two roots and pulled foliage over his body, careful not to break anything that would leave a mark. His ankle throbbed in time with his heartbeat. Every pulse reminded him how fragile his situation had become. He adjusted his position inch by inch until the pain settled into something dull and distant. Then he waited. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Time stretched until it lost shape. The jungle never slept. It whispered, crawled, shifted. Something brushed his boot and his entire body locked, muscles coiled to react. When nothing followed, he forced himself to relax again. Overreacting was as dangerous as doing nothing. His thoughts began to drift despite his effort to control them. Faces appeared without invitation. His mother's eyes, his father's hands. A girl from high school whose name he suddenly could not remember, only the way she laughed. The memories came soft and warm, and that terrified him. Warm thoughts led to comfort. Comfort led to sleep. Sleep would get him killed. Daniel bit down on the inside of his cheek until pain snapped him back. Blood filled his mouth. He swallowed it and focused again on the darkness. Sometime deep into the night, the rain returned. Not heavy this time, just enough to blur sound and erase edges. Drops tapped against leaves like fingers testing glass. Daniel welcomed it and hated it at the same time. Rain hid him, but it also hid them. Then he heard it. Movement. Slow. Deliberate. Not random. Daniel's breathing stalled. He pressed his face into the damp earth, pulling his rifle closer without lifting it. The sound came again. A foot-shifting weight. Fabric brushing bark. Too controlled to be an animal. Someone was out there. Closer than before. Daniel's mind raced through options and found none. He could not run. He could not fight. He could only remain unseen. A shape passed between two trees, barely darker than the darkness itself. Then another. They moved with spacing, with intent, hunting spacing. Daniel closed his eyes, not in fear, but in discipline. Sight tempted reaction. Reaction made mistakes. A faint click broke the silence. Metal. Someone adjusting something. Daniel's muscles trembled as adrenaline surged, begging for release. He held it down with everything he had. His chest burned from shallow breaths. His ankles screamed every time he shifted even slightly. A voice murmured nearby. Low, calm, almost casual. They were not rushing. They were confident. A shadow stopped. So close, Daniel could smell damp fabric and smoke. The figure lingered, head turning slowly, listening. Daniel felt something inside him crack. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change him. Fear burned itself out, leaving behind something colder, simpler. If they found him, it would end here. If they didn't, he would keep going. The shadow moved on. Minutes dragged past before Daniel dared to breathe fully again. When the jungle finally swallowed their sounds, Daniel did not move. He stayed pressed into the earth until the night began to thin, until the black softened into gray. Dawn was coming, and Daniel Harper was still alive. Barely. As the first weak light filtered through the canopy, Daniel understood something with quiet certainty. The jungle had tested him. The enemy had tested him, and the night had nearly broken him. But he was still here, and as long as he was still here, the story was not over. Dawn did not bring relief. It brought clarity. Light crept into the jungle slowly, exposing details Daniel almost wished had stayed hidden. Mud packed with footprints, bent leaves that hadn't been bent by animals, a snapped branch that had not snapped itself. The world around him looked organized, touched, worked over. They had been here in the night. Daniel waited longer than instinct told him to. Patience was the only thing keeping him alive now. When he finally moved, it was with care, so deliberate it felt unnatural. His ankle protested immediately, a sharp reminder that his body was running on borrowed time. He adjusted the binding again. It helped less than before. Hunger joined the conversation in his gut, a deep, hollow ache that made him lightheaded when he stood too quickly. He ignored it. Hunger could be endured. Thirst had taught him that much. Pain could be negotiated with. Fear could be dulled. Fatigue was different. Fatigue slipped past defenses. By mid-morning, Daniel began making mistakes. Small ones, subtle ones. The kind that stacked quietly. He stepped on dry leaves instead of mud. He chose cover that was adequate instead of ideal. Once he leaned against a tree without checking behind it first. When he realized what he had done, his hands shook so badly he had to kneel until it passed. He was slowing, and he knew it. The jungle pressed closer, spout thickening as the ground dipped. Low areas meant water, but they also meant predictability. He fought the urge to follow the slope. They would expect that, so he went the other way, uphill. Each step burned. His ankle felt loose now, unstable, like it no longer belonged to him. His breathing grew louder no matter how hard he tried to control it. Sweat soaked his uniform again, stinging where thorns had cut his skin. Then he smelled it. Smoke. Not old, not imagined. Fresh. Daniel stopped instantly, heart hammering. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. And people meant the hunt was no longer theoretical. He dropped low and crawled forward until he could see through a break in the foliage. Below him, no more than 50 yards away, was a small camp. Not permanent, not careless. A few men, weapons stacked within reach, a pot suspended over embers that still glowed faintly. One man squatted, checking something on the ground. Tracks. Daniel pulled back slowly, pulse roaring in his ears. They were not just close, they were ahead of him. His vision tunneled as realization hit. He had been reacting, adjusting, surviving step to step. They had been planning, predicting, cutting angles. The net wasn't tightening, it was nearly closed. Daniel backed away, turning to retreat, and the world tilted. His ankle gave out completely. He went down hard, catching himself with one arm just in time to stop his rifle from striking a rock. Pain exploded up his leg, white hot and blinding. He bit down on a shout, tears springing uninvited to his eyes. He stayed there, pressed to the ground, shaking. For the first time since he'd been cut off, a thought surfaced that he could not push away. I can't keep this up. The admission didn't come with panic. It came with exhaustion, bone deep and honest. Daniel dragged himself behind a fallen log and lay still, staring at nothing. His chest rose and fell too fast. His hands trembled uncontrollably now. He was at the edge, not of discovery, of collapse. Somewhere nearby, a voice called out. Another answered. Daniel closed his eyes, not to hide, but because opening them took too much effort. And for the first time since this began, Daniel Harper wondered, not if he would escape, but how long it would take them to find him. The voices did not rush him. That was the worst part. They moved with patience now, drifting through the jungle like a tide that knew the shoreline would eventually give way. Branches shifted, leaves whispered. Somewhere metal clicked softly, equipment being adjusted, not dropped. Professionals. Daniel lay behind the fallen log, chest pressed into damp earth, forcing air in and out through his nose. Each breath scraped his throat. His ankle throbbed in slow, nauseating pulses. He tested it once, just a fraction of movement, and had to bite his sleeve to keep from making a sound. Running was over. That truth settled heavily, but it was also clarifying. Like exhaustion stripping away panic, it left only decisions. He checked his rifle. One magazine seated, two left. Not much. Enough to fight. Not enough to win. Winning wasn't possible. Surviving might be. Daniel shifted his attention outward, letting his vision soften the way he'd been taught in training exercises he'd once thought unrealistic. Peripheral. Broad. Patient. He stopped looking for enemies and started looking for opportunity. The ground sloped sharply beyond the log, dropping into a tangle of vines and shadow where the jungle grew thick and hostile. The kind of place men avoided unless they had to. Visibility there would be terrible, movement slow, but noise would be swallowed, and scent, and tracks. Daniel understood then what his last move had to be. He waited until the voices drifted closer, close enough that he could hear breath between words, close enough that fear threatened to spike again. He let it come, let it crest. Then he acted. He slid sideways, inch by inch, never lifting his body, letting gravity carry him just enough to disappear into the slope. The vines grabbed at him immediately, tearing at his uniform, catching his gear. Pain flared as his ankle twisted again, but he did not stop. Stopping was no longer an option. He used his knife to cut himself free where he had to, choosing fabric over flesh when possible, flesh over noise when necessary. Blood smeared his hands. He didn't care. Behind him, a voice called out again, sharper this time. Daniel kept moving. The slope dropped more steeply than he'd expected. He slid, then fell, then slid again, landing hard in mud that sucked at him like wet cement. He stayed down, letting the jungle close over him, pulling vines and leaves across his body until his outline vanished. He did not move again. Not when footsteps approached the edge above. Not when someone cursed softly. Not when a rock tumbled down the slope and struck the log he'd been hiding behind moments earlier. They searched the wrong place. Minutes passed, then more. Rain began again, light at first, then heavier, blurring scent and sound, erasing what little trail he had left. Daniel lay half submerged in mud, rainwater pooling around his chest, breathing shallow and slow. His body shook uncontrollably now, from cold, from pain, from everything he'd been holding back. But he was still alive. When the voices finally faded for real this time, Daniel did not feel relief. He felt resolve. Whatever came next, capture, escape, or death, it would not come easily for them. The jungle had taken everything from him except one thing. He was still here. And as long as he was still here, the hunt was not over. Night fell without ceremony. No warning. No transition. One moment the jungle held the dim, bruised colors of dusk. The next, it swallowed everything. Black layered on black, depth erased, distance meaningless. Daniel did not move. Mud had dried stiff against his uniform. Rainwater cooled against his skin until shivering became impossible to control. He pressed his tongue against the roof of his mouth, counting breaths, anchoring himself to rhythm instead of thought. In the dark, the jungle became something else. It was no longer terrain, it was presence. Things moved that he could not see. Wings brushed air, bodies slid over bark. Something crawled across his boot and disappeared again. He did not react. Reacting invited noise. Noise invited death. His ankles screamed every time his muscles twitched involuntarily. He adjusted once, slow by millimeter, until the pain settled into a dull, livable burn. Then he waited. Hours passed without shape. Time lost edges. Hunger gnawed, but thirst was worse again. He rationed memory the way he rationed water, small pieces, carefully chosen. His mother's voice, the smell of cut grass, anything quiet. At some point he heard them again. Not close, but not gone. Movement uphill, a pause, another whistle, different pattern this time. Slower. Questioning. Daniel's heart accelerated, then steadied. Fear was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer sharp panic. It was heavy, managed, familiar. They were unsure now. The slope, the rain, the darkness, it had cost them certainty. That mattered. Daniel tightened his grip on the rifle, not to fire, but to remind himself it was real. That he still had agency, still had choices, even if they were narrowing. A flare burst somewhere far to the east, briefly painting the canopy in ghostly white. Shadows jumped, froze, vanished. Daniel did not look toward it. Light drew attention. Instead, he used the moment to crawl again, deeper downhill, into a pocket where water collected and rot softened sound. The movement cost him everything. When he stopped, he tasted bile and copper and had to rest his forehead against the mud to keep from retching. He lay there afterward, barely conscious. The jungle breathed. So did he. By the time the night began to thin, when black softened into charcoal and shapes hinted at form, Daniel Harper was still alive. Barely, but alive, and somewhere above him, the men hunting him were beginning to realize something unsettling. This was taking longer than it should, and in war, uncertainty was dangerous. For everyone. Night came without mercy. Daniel did not remember choosing where to stop. His body simply failed him. One moment he was moving downhill through mud and roots, every step negotiated through pain and will. The next, his legs folded beneath him, and the jungle accepted his weight without comment. He lay on his side, chest heaving, rain-soaked earth pressed against his cheek. His ankle throbbed in deep, pulsing waves. Fever burned behind his eyes. When he tried to lift his head, the world tilted violently, then slid back into darkness. For a long time, there was nothing. Then sound returned in fragments. Rain dripping from leaves, insects humming, a distant, mechanical thud. At first, Daniel thought it was another hallucination. He had heard voices that weren't there, seen water that vanished when he reached for it. His mind had betrayed him before, but this sound was different. It came again. Whup, 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 whup. Helicopter blades. Daniel's eyes snapped open. He forced himself onto an elbow, then collapsed back down, dizzy and gasping. The sound grew louder, then faded, then returned again. Circling. Search pattern. Hope surged, sharp and dangerous. He had been warned about this feeling too. Hope made men reckless. Hope made them stand up when they shouldn't. He stayed where he was. When the helicopter came around again, closer this time, Daniel reached for his last flare. His fingers fumbled clumsily with the casing. His hands were swollen, clumsy, barely obeying him. The sound drifted away. Panic clawed up his chest. "No," he whispered, his voice barely a sound. He struck the flare. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then red light exploded into the night. Daniel shoved the flare upward with everything he had left, watching it arc through the trees before snagging briefly on branches, showering sparks, then burning free into open air. He collapsed back into the mud, breath tearing from his chest, vision narrowing. The helicopter turned. The sound changed. Urgent now. Purposeful. Spotlights cut through the canopy, white beams tearing holes in the darkness. One passed over him, then another. The third stopped. Daniel tried to raise an arm. It barely moved. He opened his mouth to shout, but no sound came out. Still, the light stayed on him. Minutes later, the jungle shook as the helicopter lowered a rescue line. Hands grabbed him. Strong hands. American hands. Voices shouted words he couldn't quite understand. Daniel Harper was lifted out of the jungle he had believed would kill him. He did not remember the flight back. He woke up days later in a field hospital, wrapped in bandages, now ankle immobilized, body wrecked by dehydration, infection, and exhaustion. A medic told him he had been missing for nearly 4 days. 4 days behind enemy lines, 4 days alone. They called it survival. Daniel did not. He returned to his unit weeks later, thinner, quieter, eyes older than before. The men clapped his shoulder. Someone called him lucky. He did not correct them. Vietnam continued. Patrols resumed. Orders were followed. The war did not pause to acknowledge what he had endured. Eventually, Daniel Harper went home. But the jungle went with him. Silence still made his skin crawl. Footsteps behind him still made his heart race. Water was never something he wasted again. He lived a long life after Vietnam, worked, married, raised children, smiled when expected. But some nights, even decades later, he woke before dawn, mouth dry, heart pounding, convinced for just a moment that he was still there. Injured, hunted, listening for whistles in the dark. Daniel Harper survived the war. But survival, he learned, was not the same thing as escape. And some jungles never truly let you go.